All right, everyone, welcome back. We love diving deep into these topics, and today we're tackling one that's honestly been on my mind quite a bit lately, and it's a listener request.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at Russia's military actions since World War II.
Okay.
So, those of you who follow this stuff, I mean, it's impossible to ignore the echoes of the Cold War and what's happening today.
Absolutely.
But to really understand it, we need to go back and look at the whole picture, and we're going to use this book here,
Right.
Russian and Soviet military intervention since World War II. Kind of lays it all out, from the Soviet era right up to today.
And the timing couldn't be more relevant, right? I mean, with everything going on in Ukraine, it makes you wonder, even though the Cold War is over, those interventions, they didn't stop, did they?
No, they didn't. So how many countries has Russia actually invaded since World War II? The answer might surprise you, but first we need to lay the groundwork.
Definitely.
So let's bring in our expert who can help us unpack all of this. Welcome to the show.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start with that Soviet era, that period from 1945 to 1991.
Okay.
And the book really drives home this point.
Yeah.
For the USSR, it was all about control and expansion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the leaders, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, for them, military force, well, it was the main tool to get what they wanted.
Right, it was their hammer.
Exactly. Solidify their hold on Eastern Europe and then expand that communist influence as far as they could.
And one of the first big tests of this, well, it comes in 1956 in Hungary.
Oh, yeah.
People there, they're hopeful, they're excited for change, and then, bam, the Soviets come crashing in.
Yeah, the Hungarian Revolution, I mean, that was a real turning point. People wanted out of the Warsaw Pact. They wanted democracy.
Right.
But the Soviet response, brutal. The Red Army just crushed it, thousands dead. And the message was clear: you don't mess with Soviet authority.
It really set the stage for how they deal with any kind of challenge. And then a little over a decade later, similar story in Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring. Right. But this one, it wasn't just about crushing an uprising. It was about taking down a challenge to their whole way of thinking.
You're talking about the Brezhnev doctrine here.
Right, yeah.
I mean, the Prague Spring with Alexander Dubček, it wasn't just about reforms. It was about saying, hey, the USSR doesn't have a right to intervene in these countries. And if they let that stand, well, their whole grip on Eastern Europe could have unraveled.
So it wasn't just about putting down a rebellion. It was about making an example out of Czechoslovakia.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. But then things get even more intense with the Soviet-Afghan War.
Oh, yeah.
A full-blown war, devastating consequences. And I mean, their goals there, they're a little less clear, aren't they?
Well, the Soviet-Afghan War, that was a catastrophe. 10 years, 1979 to 1989.
Right.
Officially, they were there to back up the communist government against these Mujahideen fighters, but that government, incredibly unpopular, facing a huge insurgency. The Soviets were propping up a failing regime in a country, well, they totally underestimated.
And that mistake, I mean, it had huge consequences, not just for Afghanistan, but for the Soviets themselves, right?
Absolutely a turning point. It drained them, demoralized their military, even fueled dissent back home.
Wow.
A lot of historians see it as one of the key factors that led to the collapse of the USSR in '91.
Okay, so it's not just about ideological control anymore. It's about the limits of Soviet or later Russian military power. But before we move on from that Soviet era, there's one more piece we got to talk about. The Baltic States.
Right.
I was reading about this, and their story, it starts even before World War II, which I didn't know.
Yeah, the fate of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania often gets overlooked, but it's crucial to understanding all of this. I mean, in 1940, thanks to that secret pact between the Nazis and the Soviets, they were forced into the USSR.
Right.
And then after the war, they stayed under Soviet control. Decades of repression.
Deportations, suppressing any dissent, trying to erase their national identities is a dark chapter.
Oh, absolutely. The Soviets saw them as strategically vital right on the Baltic Sea. They had to control them to project their power.
Right.
They deported tens of thousands to Siberian labor camps, crushed any dissent, tried to wipe out their cultures.
A stark reminder of the human cost of these interventions.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is, despite all that, they got their independence back in 1991.
They did. It's amazing.
That must have been incredible.
A testament to their resilience. They never gave up hope. And their story, it offers a glimmer of hope in this whole dark narrative of Soviet intervention, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen how the Soviets used military force to maintain control, expand their influence, But then the USSR collapses, a new era begins.
Right.
So the question is, did that change Russia's behavior?
Well, that's what we're going to find out.
Exactly. On to post-Soviet Russia. Let's see if they learned anything from those costly Soviet-era adventures.
We shall see. You know, it's fascinating. Even though the whole world changed after the Soviet Union fell apart, some things stayed the same.
Yeah, like,
Well, Russia, they were no longer this superpower, but they still saw these former Soviet republics, as like their territory, part of their sphere of influence.
that near broad idea. I remember reading about that.
Exactly, but it goes deeper than just geography, right? They saw these countries as linked to their own security, their identity.
So they'd intervene there, but not, say, in Finland, even though it's right on their border, too.
Exactly. The USSR breaking up, it wasn't just losing land, it was like losing part of who they were on the world stage.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at some examples. The book points to Moldova in 1992 as the first post-Soviet intervention.
Right.
Honestly, I didn't know much about this conflict at all.
Transnistria, that breakaway region of Moldova, it's a perfect example of how Russia kept pulling strings even when their own power was uncertain.
Okay.
They gave direct military support to these separatists who wanted to split from Moldova.
So basically backing a proxy force to destabilize a neighbor.
Exactly, kind of like what the Soviets did, just smaller scale.
Right.
And the Russian 14th Army being there in Transnistria, well, that helped the separatists a lot, even today. It's basically a Russian-controlled area inside Moldova.
A frozen conflict just waiting to flare up again.
Yeah, and it shows how Russia could use these smaller conflicts to keep their influence in the region.
Like they were testing the waters, seeing what they could get away with.
Yeah, maybe.
And then things get much more serious. In 2008, the Russo-Georgian War.
Oh, yeah?
This was a major escalation.
It was. First time post-Soviet Russia actually went to war with another recognized country.
They weren't just backing separatists anymore. They were fighting another country's army.
Exactly.
And this time, it was about Georgia trying to regain control of South Ossetia and Abkhazia.
Right?
Two more breakaway regions with ties to Russia. It's that same pattern again.
It is. Russia supported those separatist movements, gave them weapons, training, political backing, and when Georgia tried to step in, well, Russia hit them hard with their military.
It was a short war, but intense. Russia ended up occupying parts of Georgia, recognizing those breakaway regions, and they still have troops there today.
Yeah.
This must have really shaken things up internationally.
Oh, definitely. It was a wake-up call. I mean,
Yeah.
here was Russia directly challenging another country's territory.
Right?
The West condemned it, but there weren't many real consequences. Russia showed they were willing to use force to get what they wanted, even if it meant breaking international law.
So in both Moldova and Georgia, we see Russia flexing its muscles, showing they're the boss in their backyard. These frozen conflicts become a way to keep control, stop those countries from getting too close to the West.
Right.
But the biggest and most tragic example of this, well, has to be Ukraine.
Yeah, no question.
Ukraine is where all these trends come together. It's been going on for almost a decade, and now it's a full-scale war affecting the whole world.
It's a tragedy.
The book really stresses how important that Euromaidan revolution was back in 2014.
Oh, absolutely.
This wasn't just about politics. It was about Ukraine choosing their own path.
Exactly. Ukrainians wanted closer ties to Europe. They wanted to move away from Russia's influence.
And the Kremlin, well, they saw that as a huge threat.
They did. They were afraid of losing control over Ukraine, a country they see as vital to them historically, culturally, strategically.
And their reaction was fast and aggressive.
Oh, yeah.
First, they took Crimea, which everyone condemned as illegal.
It was a total land grab, breaking international law. Russia used the Russian speakers living in Crimea as an excuse, saying they needed protection from the new Ukrainian government.
Right.
But it was all about strategy, getting control of the Black Sea, sending a message, don't you dare drift away from us.
But Crimea was just the start.
Right. And unfortunately, yeah.
They started backing separatists in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, fueling a proxy war.
Exactly. Weapons, training, sometimes even direct military support, all while denying they were involved.
Right.
It created this long conflict, destabilizing the region, making it even harder for Ukraine to move towards the West. Classic hybrid warfare, a mix of military and non-military tactics. Get what you want while pretending you're not doing anything.
And it all leads up to that full-scale invasion in February 2022.
Yeah.
Shocking. But looking back, maybe we should have seen it coming.
It was a huge miscalculation by Putin. He thought he could take over quickly, put his own people in charge.
Right.
But Ukrainians fought back hard, and the West united against Russia. The invasion's been a disaster for them on every level.
It's brought the West together, made NATO stronger. isolated Russia globally, not to mention the human cost. It's unimaginable, the suffering.
Millions displaced, cities in ruins, war crimes, a humanitarian catastrophe.
We don't even know the long-term consequences yet. It's changed the whole geopolitical map of Europe. The effects will be felt for years. So we've gone from smaller conflicts like Transnistria to a huge war in Ukraine. It makes you ask, why? Why does this keep happening, even after the Soviet Union is gone? Is it just Putin? Or is there something deeper going on in how Russia sees the world?
It really does feel like there's this pattern, ingrained in their behavior. But we can't just stop at seeing the pattern. We got to understand why it's there. Is it just about one man's ambitions, or is there something more like fundamental to how Russia sees itself that leads to these interventions?
It's a tough question, and we can't oversimplify it. Putin's definitely a big part of it. But this goes back further. We see it throughout Russian history, even before the Soviets. This idea that they need to control their neighbors to feel secure, that those countries aren't really independent, they're just a buffer zone.
It's like they can't let go of that empire. They lost the physical control when the Soviet Union fell apart, but they're still trying to call the shots, stop these countries from truly going their own way, especially getting close to the West. Exactly, and this gets to the heart of some big problems in international relations, like how do we balance the idea that every country gets to decide its own fate with the responsibility to help people who are facing violence and oppression? That tension, we see it over and over in these interventions.
Because on one hand, you've got this principle that each country gets to choose its own path, its own alliances. But then you see a powerful country like Russia using its military to push its neighbors around to take their land. And you have to ask, when is it okay to step in? When does the world have a duty to do something?
Those are the tough questions, and there are no easy answers. We can't just sit back and watch terrible things happen, but any intervention, well, it comes with risks. Things can go wrong.
Right, like we saw in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, interventions can make things worse, destabilize whole regions, even cause more suffering.
Exactly.
It feels like we're walking a tightrope. How do we uphold international law, stop aggression, but not make things worse? How do we help those caught in the middle of these conflicts without getting dragged into a bigger war? This whole deep dive has really shown how hard it is to navigate this world where the old rules don't seem to work anymore.
I think the first step is realizing that this isn't black and white. These are complicated issues with a long history. We need to understand the details, the different points of view, why everyone is doing what they're doing. We can't just say good guys versus bad guys. We need a more nuanced conversation.
That makes sense. If we just simplify things, well, we're going to keep making the same mistakes.
Exactly.
You got to learn from history, see the patterns, the warning signs. So maybe, hopefully, we could stop these conflicts from happening in the future.
I agree. Knowledge is power. The more we understand these complex issues, the better we can handle the challenges ahead. And it's not just for politicians and diplomats. It's for all of us as citizens to talk about these things, demand better from our leaders, and work towards a more peaceful world.
Well said. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's been eye-opening, a little scary, honestly, but so valuable.
It's been great exploring these ideas with you. It's through these kinds of open conversations that we can start to make sense of this complicated world.
To everyone listening, thanks for joining us. We hope you keep exploring these topics, read more, listen to different voices, and form your own opinions.
And remember, think critically, especially in this world where there's so much information out there. Don't just accept things at face value. Question your assumptions, challenge your biases, and keep searching for the truth.
That's a perfect way to end it. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those critical thinking caps on.